All right, let's go ahead and get started for this evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And tonight I'm joined by Rebecca Golden with Bee and Bloom. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us.
So tonight's presentation is on plants and pollinators. So we'll be talking a little bit about pollinators that can be found within the Pacific Northwest, and also highlighting some native plants that do a great job of attracting them and helping sustain them. So you might be able to incorporate some into your gardens, both container and in the ground. So just to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording tonight's presentation and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel tomorrow. I'll also be sending out a follow-up email with a link to that recording, as well as a couple of links to some resources that we'll be discussing tonight. So if you do need to step away, don't worry, you'll be able to pick up the webinar from wherever you left off once you receive that follow-up email. If you are watching this recording on YouTube, those resources that I just mentioned are also linked in the description below this video. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. At the end of tonight's presentation, we will have a chance to have a Q&A. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free just to go ahead and click on that icon and you can enter your questions. And Rebecca and I are more than happy to answer them once we finish up with the presentation. And finally, there is a survey that will pop up at the very end of this presentation when you exit the Zoom link here. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that, it is a great help in helping us develop these workshops and these webinars. If you live in Washington County and you complete that survey, you can also incorporate your mailing address, and we'll send you some additional resources on pollinators that you might be able to use. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so before we get into the main content today, I want to talk a little bit about soil and water conservation districts, and specifically us at the Tualatin SWCD. So the Tualatin SWCD has been around since 1955. We're one of 45 soil and water conservation districts in Oregon. Our service area is in Washington County, which you can see on that map right there, just outside of the Portland area. Now, our primary goal as a SWCD is that we work with our community to help provide sustainable solutions to enhance our natural resources, mostly soil, water, you name it. We do that through three ways. We do that through technical assistance. We offer advice. We do site visits, you name it. We also do that through financial assistance. We have grants that we provide to organizations. If you have a qualifying project, we also can fund that project or put funding towards that project. And we do that through education programs, through the one that you're joining us for this evening. If you don't live in Washington County, I highly encourage you to take a look to seek out your local SWCD. Many of these resources are available throughout every county in the United States nearly. So whether you can participate in our resources or in resources from your local SWCD, it's always a great way to check out. A little bit of background on soil and water conservation districts, because oftentimes folks don't know what they are. I know before I started this position, I wasn't quite sure what a soil and water conservation district was before I really started researching it. So SWCDs were formed out of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. In the 30s, there was a natural disaster, as I mentioned, called the Dust Bowl. And what happened during that time was, the years leading up, farming practices weren't what they were today. And so farmers were deep plowing many of their fields, and that upended a lot of natural grasses throughout the Midwest. Now, after years of drought and large winds started to pick up that dirt and take it to the air, and that dust really enveloped most of the Midwest and the East Coast. And it made the United States government at the time realize that they needed to have an organization that could help establish better farming practices throughout our communities. Now, so they established what then was known as the Soil Conservation Service. And today, that's what soil and water conservation districts are. Our principles are the same as they were back then. We are local. As I mentioned, we're based in every county in the United States. We really work on a local level. We are non-regulatory, so we don't assess fines. We're really just here to help. And so that's what we're trying to do throughout most of our areas. And we're also responsible to everyone within our community. We always like to say that we work on a watershed level at our soil and water conservation district. A little bit about watersheds as well. So watersheds are essentially a form of land. So land will form kind of a bowl or a basin or a bathtub, if you will, by the many contours that you'll find around us. This illustration shows what the Tualatin River watershed is, and that's the watershed that we focus on at Tualatin SWCD. In the west of our watershed, you can see that the coastal range. To the north is the Tualatin Mountains, and then to the south is the Chehalis Mountains. And what that sets up this bowl that collects all of the rainwater that falls on it. Now, as that rainwater falls down, it collects on the ground or seeps into the groundwater, and it slowly flows towards the Tualatin River. We like to say we work on a watershed level because we work anywhere that water touches. So anywhere within our county, within our watershed, we like to provide conservation assistance throughout that area. As that water flows through the Tualatin River, it touches our forested lands, our agricultural lands, our urban lands, before eventually flowing out to the Willamette and then eventually up to the Columbia River. Now, how do pollinators fit into this watershed? Well, pollinators are essential for native plants. And native plants really are a huge indicator of a healthy watershed. Native plants grow deeper roots than non-native plants. So they help stabilize soils, which can reduce the effects of erosion that you might find. Native plants also are adjusted to our climate. And so they are more resilient in our ever-changing climate so that we can have a lusher landscape that provides better habitat for both the pollinators as well as other wildlife and people that we like to, and when we like to go out into nature to explore. And native plants don't require pesticides or fertilizers that oftentimes can lead to pollution that can enter our waterways and lower our water quality. So native plants are an important part of our ecosystem, and they can't do their job unless they have pollinators to help expand their existence. And we can't help support these native plants and these pollinators unless we know a little bit more about them, which is what we're hoping to do tonight.
All right, so let's dive in then to what pollination is and who can do it. So we're going to start way, way, way back at the beginning to about 125 million years ago when the first flowering plants actually arose in our terrestrial settings. Prior to that introduction, a lot of our plants were reproducing in different ways. And so they would, either have gametes that would travel through water to fertilize other plants, or would be wind pollinated. Some of them did produce pollen. But there were some insects then who started taking advantage of plant resources. And the first ones to do that were really flies and beetles. And so they'd start eating that pollen or gathering foods and resources from these flowers that really that kind of gave a new opportunity to the plant kingdom for sexual reproduction. And so then we have angiosperms, or flowering plants that came onto the scene around 125 million years ago. And that kind of at the exact same times when our first bees started showing up on the scene. And so we think that the new floral resource provided an opportunity for bees to exist and to radiate. And so there's this really close relationship between our pollinators and our plants that have evolved over millions and millions of years. Wasps were some of the first insects that would actually gather nectar from flowers as an energy source, but they would hunt or find soft-bodied insects or a lot of other invertebrates to feed their young as a protein source. And now I just read that they think the first wasp that developed the ability to eat pollen was actually hunting for thrips, which is another group of insects that were found on flowers and would have pollen on their bodies. And so they were feeding these pollen-covered thrips to their young, and their young started to develop the ability to digest and metabolize proteins from pollen. And so from that one kind of wasp ancestor, all bees radiated, and bees visit flowers of all kinds, are incredibly diverse, and are arguably the best pollinators because they are specifically evolved to gather and grab onto pollen as their food source to bring back and feed their young. And so they're spreading tons of that pollen around to the next flowers that they visit and allowing those plants to reproduce and to produce seeds and in a lot of times fruit as well. So not only invertebrates can pollinate. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we do have a good amount of hummingbird species that will provide some pollination services. They nectar feed and in the process are getting pollen on their proboscis-like tongues, and they will inevitably transfer some. But really, a pollinator is any animal that is a vector for the pollen from one plant to another one of the same species. And so even if you have a frog that's sheltering on a plant, they may not be gathering pollen or nectar specifically, but if they're hopping from flower to flower and are moving pollen around, they are certainly pollinators. Bats are an important group of pollinators in North America, not so much in the Pacific Northwest, but in the desert and in places where there are more cacti. And even humans can pollinate. A lot of times this is out of necessity. So a lot of date farms rely on human pollination to produce dates. And that's what this image here in the bottom corner is, where they actually have this kind of string of cotton balls that they'll loop around the blooms and pull them up to transfer pollen around. And it's an interesting process and one that takes a lot of training, but it also takes a lot of physical manual labor. But humans can absolutely be deliberate pollinators. All right, and so tonight you'll hear me talking about native versus non-native pollinators pretty regularly. And basically all I mean is that native pollinators are insects, we'll primarily be talking about insects and invertebrates that evolved in a particular region. And so the natives that we have in the Pacific Northwest are unique to our climate and have adapted and evolved with our native plants over many, 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 many years. So there's really this divide in North America of the native species that are on the west of the Rockies and the native species that are to the east of the Rockies. And often we'll even have introduced species from other continents altogether. So a very common bee that we have here, or one that's really ubiquitous everywhere except Antarctica, is that European honeybee. They are non-native species. We may have a European wool carder bee like this one here. And then even solitary bees like Osmia. So we have a mason bee, or Osmia cornifrons, is from Asia. And then we have an introduced species, common eastern bumblebee, that we see quite regularly, that was introduced here for tomato pollination and has been reared for greenhouse tomato pollination. But really, the pollinators that we're going to be focusing on are ones that are native to this ecoregion, because they are the ones that have evolved and adapted with the plants we have here and are going to be providing the most benefit to those native plants that we have. All right. And I will also just do a quick note about non-native pollinators and how they may actually be perpetuating the spread of invasive plants. So garlic mustard is the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District Weed of the Month. And honeybees love garlic mustard, and they will absolutely pollinate garlic mustard and facilitate its spread. And so it's really important to kind of walk the balance between encouraging native species and doing our best to mitigate non-native species if at all possible. There are many, many wonderful reasons to keep honeybees, and it's a really close cultural relationship. I personally keep honeybees and have been keeping them for a long time, but it is something that you'll want to keep in mind, and especially if you have honeybees, to really work on your invasive plant management on your property if at all possible. And then something else I'd like to mention, and I'm not trying to bash honeybees for too long tonight, but there is some evidence that they may negatively impact native bees and wild bees by transmitting pathogens and outcompeting them for floral resources, which tend to be the limiting factor of how many bees and pollinators we can support in our environments. This here is a link to an article that's specifically talking about that if you're interested in going deeper. And what attracts pollinators in general are going to be floral resources. And there are many different types of floral resources, but for most invertebrates that are visiting flowers, they are going to be gathering nectar. Nectar is a sugary substance that plants produce kind of as an enticement. And so flowers are this kind of big showy display. They're drawing insects in, and then when they land, they can get a sip of something sugary and sweet that will give them energy and carbohydrates and kind of fuel the rest of their goings-ons. And then some insects specifically will be gathering pollen as a protein source. And bees are the ones who do this most commonly because bees are what we call an herbivorous insect that rely on pollen as their protein source to feed their young for the most part. But there are some flies that will also eat pollen as a quick protein source that will help them lay eggs. And so there are, and some wasps that will ingest pollen and carry pollen internally before going back to their nest. And so that can also be a really important resource, primarily for bees, but also for many other insects and invertebrates. If you notice the difference, so this is the same wasp, cuckoo wasp that was gathering nectar. You can see has little bits of pollen on her face, but it's really nothing compared to the sheer amount of Cheeto dust all over this longhorn bee. And so you can really see kind of the difference in quality, at least for the plant, of how the invertebrate or how the insect is picking up that pollen and then being a vector for it or moving it around. But there is some that does occur with anything that lands on a flower and is picking up that pollen. Other things that might attract pollinators are nesting materials. So a lot of you are probably familiar with mason bees at this point. You know that they need clayey mud to gather for nesting materials. But plants can provide nesting materials to other bees and other invertebrates as well. So in the case of leafcutter bees that are very similar to those mason bees that will nest in secondary tunnels and can be managed, they're cutting out little circles of soft leaves or petals to line their brood chambers. And they'll use that as kind of a line of defense to plug up a nest from predators, but also to allow their larvae to incorporate that natural material into their cocoons for when they pupate. And so it's a really important resource for them. And if they don't have that in the area, they won't be able to nest there. And so a lot of times that's going to be soft materials like from roses or peas tend to be really loved by leaf cutting bees. And then there are some other leaf cutting bees that don't use plant materials at all. And they're actually they're in the same genus, so they're very, very closely related, but they're gathering resins to line their nesting materials and to kind of form those chambers. And so they're getting plant resins from things like cottonwood buds or a lot of tree saps and things that tend to be really, really gluey and sticky. Wool carder bees will kind of card the soft, fuzzy materials off of leaves. And then one of my favorite groups of bees are orchid bees. Unfortunately, they don't live here in the Pacific Northwest, but I had to give them a shout out. They'll actually, the males of that group will gather floral oils as like a perfume to attract female mates. And they have become really important and really good pollinators of those orchids that they're gathering oils from. And then lastly, I'd like to just give a little shout out to water. It can be a really great thing to provide watering holes for bees and other wildlife habitat in your area. And that can be something as simple as a bird bath with stones in it so they have somewhere to land. You could even put like some floating plant material, but natural bodies of water, natural ponds and water features are going to be incredibly useful and attractive for your local pollinators. All right, so pollen and nectar and floral resources are going to be incredibly important for adult pollinators. And butterflies are, of course, flower visiting nectar feeders that provide pollination as adults. But those adults are also looking for host plants that they can lay their eggs on. And when those eggs hatch, the larvae or the caterpillars of those butterflies will eat those host plants as their only food source. And so, of course, we're all familiar with monarchs needing milkweed. Whether the monarch path really extends much into Washington County is debatable. They mostly are, their pathway is going to be coastal in Oregon, if at all. But if you do kind of live in those coastal areas or have properties or visit coastal areas or have any control over what kind of plants go there, showy milkweed and other milkweeds are going to be really, really useful for those monarch stopover points as they're doing their big migrations. And then here, when under the monarch section, there's a Western monarch call to action for a big study and a big push, conservation push that's being headed by the Xerces Society. Here, the ones that are most common are going to be the Western tiger swallowtail, and they're host plant generalists, which is really great. And they'll generally lay their eggs and their host plants will be trees. And so those can be really abundant resources for a lot of Western swallowtails, Western tiger swallowtails. And it's probably why we see them all over the place in the summertime. There are some other swallowtails that are more specific. We'll talk about ocean spray as a good floral blooming plant. But it's also a great host plant for the pale swallowtail. We've got skippers that are generally going to host on canary grass and wheat grasses. And then sulfurs are going to be more like on vetch or lupin. And then coppers as well are really gorgeous and pretty abundant butterflies that will nest on things like sorrels or silverweed. Sometimes they'll use invasives as host plants, and we definitely don't recommend planting those ones as host plants, but it's just something to keep in mind. All right, so there is a phrase in pollination ecology called the Pollination Syndrome, and it is a specific set of floral characteristics. So it could be morphological shape, where the pollen is concealed in the flower, the shape of the petals or the petal display, color, scent, and it can even be the quality of the nectar or pollen that they're providing to their visitors. And ultimately, a syndrome is going to be, a specific set of those traits that attracts a specific type of bee. And in pollination ecology, you can think of it as a symbiotic relationship, but it's really more of a mutualistic exploitation. So the plant is trying to attract a pollinator that's going to give them the most bang for their buck. And so they want a pollinator that's going to come grab as much pollen as they can and then spread as much pollen of that from that visit as they can. So they're providing these nectar and pollen resources, but they're very energetically costly for that plant to produce. And if they're not having as much of it spread, then they're going to come up with other mechanisms or defense mechanisms against those pollinators to prevent them from exploiting their resource quite so well. And so it's kind of this arms race that has evolved a ton of really, really unique floral characteristics. There are some plants where you will see a bee kind of get into the nectar tube to gather nectar, and then the anther of that plant will kind of just tap them on the back. So they'll deposit a little packet of pollen in a spot where the bee can't groom, and then as soon as they go to the next plant and pass through that nectar tube, that pollen package is going to get picked up by the female part of the flower. And so that's one that doesn't really allow a lot of wiggle room. Some might develop really stiff anthers that have to be buzzed or shaken to get the pollen out of it. There's a whole group of asters that have phytotoxins in their plant pollen that detract a lot of pollinators. But there are a specific group of bees that are specialists on asters, or things that will gather pollen from asters specifically in order to have to kind of take on that same chemical defense against predators or from microbial invasion. So it's really just an incredible diversity of traits, floral traits, and then behaviors from their visiting insects. And so we don't really have strict pollination syndromes. They all kind of bleed into each other, and bees tend to be pretty adaptable to their environments. And so they can switch host plants pretty readily. All right. And most Pacific Northwest natives that we have here are generalists. And so they'll visit many, many different types of plants in order to gather a full suite of their nutritional needs. So this is a yellow-faced bumblebee. They're incredibly common. They're kind of a cosmopolitan bumblebee. They've adapted to do really well in urban environments. And so we see them everywhere, and they will visit everything. And they are really incredible at gathering pollen from a multitude of kind of floral morphologies, including the ones that tend to be a little bit more difficult. And so in the case of solanums, so like this tomato flower here, we have those really stiff porocidal anthers that have all of the pollen contained inside. And so in order for that pollen to be released, the bee has to bite down at the base of the anther and then vibrate her flight muscles to have it pour out. And so the plant relies on a bee that is able to do that. But they're kind of discouraging the less attractive or the less desirable bees from coming to gather pollen from them as well. And so you have kind of this tight relationship between them, except that this bee, of course, can gather pollen from many, many different types of situations. All right. So before we dive into specific plants, I'd like to just kind of shout out the importance of year-round bloom. So I mentioned that most of the Pacific Northwest natives we have here are generalists, and so they'll be able to gather pollen from many different types of flowers and different types of plants. And the thing that's going to most tie them to any specific group of plants is their blooming time. And so a lot of bees will have very short active windows during very specific times of the season. And so they'll be taking advantage of the floral resources that are available while they're active. And so we'll have some bees that are active in spring, some in summer, some later in the season. And it's really important to support all of them, or to have kind of a year-round or season-long bloom cycle so that we can support as many different types of insects or pollinators as possible. Okay.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So as Rebecca mentioned, in this next section, what we're going to do is we're going to go through each kind of blooming season, starting with the early bloomers, kind of the March through May, and then kind of midsummer bloomers, June and July, and then late bloomers. And then we'll also talk about corresponding pollinators to many of these plant species that you might be able to find. So let's get started with our early bloomers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, all good. So the first species we want to highlight is Meadow Foam. Meadow Foam is an annual, so its life cycle only lasts a single year. And it's a ground cover, so it grows very close to the ground. It really only gets about a foot tall, give or take. It prefers moist soils, so you don't want to kind of put this in a high sun area, but in a very dry area. But it can kind of grow in both full sun as well as part sun, part shade. It's a really great crop plant to put in to help combat weeds from taking place. Because it is an early bloomer, it can take up many areas that, that weeds can get into. And so you can kind of keep some of those weeds out by planting this plant. It's best to plant this, to plant meadow foam either in the fall or the warmer periods of the winter. So right now is actually a really great time to go out and start putting some meadow foam into some areas. As with any annuals, it will die off after this year, but then you can always go back in and, next fall, one of the first things you can put in is meadow foam, and it has these really brilliantly small white flowers for it. The next plant we want to highlight was tall Oregon grape. Tall Oregon grape is an evergreen shrub, so it doesn't lose its leaves during the winter time, so it'll keep all of its leaves. Tall Oregon grape is about 5 feet tall, so it is getting a little bit of a taller plant, but there are many shorter varieties that you can find. Both the dull Oregon grape, creeping Oregon grape, you name it, they're going to be very similar, just going to be on the smaller scale. Tall Oregon grape in itself is a very flexible plant. You can plant it in many situations, both full sun, part sun, as well as in a lot of different soil types, both dry as well as in moist. Tall Oregon grape is also, or Oregon grape itself is also the Oregon state flower as well. So it's a nice one to be able to incorporate into our gardens, and it's very, very easy to grow itself. Another one we want to highlight is red flowering currant. Red flowering currant is one of the first plants that you'll see in spring. If you head out right now, most likely you might see some of this. You might see red flowering currant out and about. It grows these kind of hanging red curtains, which are really beautiful when you see it in full bloom. So as long as the wind and the rain hasn't blown those blooms off, this is a great time to head out and see red flowering currant. It is a deciduous shrub, which just means that it loses its leaves during the fall time, but many of those leaves can be left on the ground and provide really great leaf litter, which also provides habitat for pollinators as we go along. It provides kind of more on the moist side of soil conditions, but it can grow in pretty much any sort of sun type. So, and it's also another easy one to grow. Now, ocean spray is one that Rebecca had mentioned earlier, and it's a fun plant. I really love the blooms of ocean spray. It has these very kind of almost spongy looking blooms, as you can see there. It is a taller plant, so it can kind of grow to 8 to 10 feet tall, but it is very adaptable. So it can grow in just about any sun condition, any soil condition. It also is drought tolerant. So as we're getting less and less rains here in the Pacific Northwest. Ocean spray is a good plant to incorporate in the gardens because it doesn't require all this constant watering that's going through, and it kind of adds a lot of charm to gardens, I like to say. And fruit trees in general, not only do they supply us humans with resources, but they also provide pollinators with resources as well. Fruit trees are often the earliest blooming trees that you can find. And so this is a great resource to provide within any garden spaces that you might have for these early pollinators to come out. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have such a huge variety of fruit trees that go. Everything from plums, cherries, apples, you name it. So really, think about what fruit you might like to eat. And most likely, not only is that tree going to support you, but it also will help support some of the wildlife within the area. And finally, the last early bloomer that I like to point out is the Oregon white oak. This plant might not be for everyone because it is so big. Oregon white oak can grow up to 70 feet tall. It can be a huge plant. Mostly in our urban settings, it's not going to get quite that big, but it is an incredibly important plant for this ecosystem. And unfortunately, their numbers are dwindling as our areas are becoming more and more urbanized. It's a deciduous tree, so it will drop all of its leaves during the year, which is actually very nice when you have a tall tree that does that, because it also provides shade to any area that you have. So it can shade your house to keep it cool during the summertime. And then during the winter, it'll drop its leaves and allow light to come in. So you can kind of, take advantage as much as that light as you can. It provides a critical habitat to this Willamette Valley ecosystem. What we always like to tell folks, when you're planting an Oregon white oak, you're not doing it for yourself, but rather you're doing it for your grandchildren. These white oaks take years and years to establish and grow, but it is a great plant to be able to plant for future generations.
Okay, and with that, we'll talk about some of the pollinators that might visit those blooms. And we'll start with kind of the poster child of spring pollination, which is mason bees. A lot of people are really familiar with the blue orchard mason bee. That is the one that is most commonly managed and lives in kind of commercial settings, but then also the ones that you'll purchase as cocoons for your backyard mason bee houses. But Osmia is actually a huge genus, and it has many, many species, many of which we actually think are still undescribed in Oregon. And there's actually a lot we still need to learn and know about them. But a great way to kind of identify them, so I'll give you a couple of tips for how to pick them out to see if they're visiting your blooms. They'll have big mandibles. They use those for scooping mud. They'll have long scopae or long hairs. Scopae, for the rest of this presentation, are just pollen collecting hairs. And so they'll have really kind of Velcro-like fur on their bellies or on the undersides of their abdomen. And they're often very dark colored. Osmia Libnaria in particular is a generalist forager, and most other species that we know of are generalists that will forage on spring blooms, but an individual might have a favorite plant that they'll have a preference for visiting, especially if it provides a lot of blooms. So, if someone comes across, a bee comes across a red flowering currant, they might visit a lot of those flowers on the same plant. Same goes for a fruit tree that has an abundance of blooms, and they may keep going back to that source if they've found that it's good and suitable and that it isn't going to run out. As for nesting, so they are those ones that will nest in your backyard houses, but they're secondary tunnel nesters. So in a natural setting, that would be like a hollow reed or an old hole that was drilled by a beetle or a woodpecker. But of course, they may be housed in artificial or man-made habitats. And as far as conservation is concerned, the managed bees are very abundant, and we think that there's an abundance of Osmia in the Pacific Northwest, but we really are lacking a lot of information on that. And this is the first point I'm going to kind of give a shout out to the Oregon Bee Atlas project. And so this is through OSU Extension and partnered with the Master Melitologist program. It's kind of like their bee version of the Master Gardeners program, where people are doing major collections statewide and giving all of their collections data to Oregon State so that they have this huge mapping project where they're going to be mapping all of the different sightings and collections of different species throughout the state. Okay. So mason bees are kind of the poster child, being the first to come out, but potentially even earlier, and for a good amount of time during spring, we're going to be seeing mining bees. And so these are really, really small bees that nest in the ground. They have black bodies and then usually really dull bands of pale hair on their abdomens, and then they're kind of blonde on their thorax and head. And they're really great or really cute because they have these kind of foveae or hairs that they use to collect pollen that are like eyebrows at the front of their faces. And that's a great way to kind of identify them. And then they'll have furry hairs kind of on the top part, the top tarsal of their back legs. And that's what they use to collect pollen. So they emerge very, very early, and they'll be generalists on spring blooms. And so they'll kind of run the gamut on the plants we talked about earlier. But in other parts of the country where spring blooms are less abundant, they may specialize on a specific host plant. All right. And as for nesting, I mentioned that they're solitary and that they nest in the ground, but they'll be in particularly sandy soil and then underground cover if they can. So if you've got a sandy soil with like a strawberry plant or something, or like the meadow foam that kind of spreads out over the top or is a good ground cover. And then if it has good drainage and sunlight, they're definitely going to move in there. And as far as conservation goes, many species are vulnerable mostly because of habitat loss and not having a great spot to nest in urban areas. They don't do well with lawns. But there are two species that are specifically named as being threatened that are native to the Columbia River. And those are important to watch out for and to kind of provide that nice bare ground for them to nest in. All right, and spring is also the season of the queen bumblebee. And so these are going to be those unbelievably large, kind of shocking and loud bees that'll start emerging early on. And so they have very large bodies. They're very hairy. I mean, you'll know them when you see them. These ones are not so tricky to identify, but they may have different patterns of yellow, black, brown, white, and orange hair kind of all over their bodies. And so they'll forage very early on while they are looking for a good nesting site. So those queens are mainly first emerging and then gathering nectar just for energy so that they can find and potentially excavate or locate an old rodent den for them to nest in underground. And so they'll hit up things like winter heath, which is like the first thing to bloom. And winter heath is actually used a lot in places where they want an abundance of bumblebees to nest, like cranberry bogs, because bumblebees are important cranberry pollinators. But they'll visit fruit trees and currant and Oregon grape and really anything that's going to provide them a little bit of sugar. And then they'll find an old burrow to start their nest in. And as soon as they kind of get that established, they'll go out and forage a little bit for pollen, but they'll set up a little group, a little cluster of daughter worker bees. And as soon as those workers have emerged and are fully formed adults, they'll start taking over the foraging duties and the queen can just stay in the nest for the rest of the season. And so you'll only see queens really at 2 times in the year. And that first time is going to be in early spring. And then as far as conservation goes for bumblebees, many species are in decline and at risk of being endangered just from increased pathogen loads that can be from an overabundance of honeybees in an area. And reduced genetic variation is a big deal too, because they've gone through a bottleneck. They've lost a lot of habitat. They've had a lot of death from pathogens. And so they've lost a lot of their genetic variation and are more susceptible to going extinct because they don't really have a lot of the genetic tools needed to adapt quickly to new situations. And so these ones are definitely critical to look out for, and providing those really early blooms are good for queens while they're looking for their nesting sites. Okay. So we'll get away from bees now, but flies are also very early to the scene. And that's going to be flies in general start emerging as soon as temperatures are, in the 40s. And so when you're identifying a fly pollinator, often they mimic bees or look like bees or wasps, and they'll have that kind of striping. And, often we'll use context to decide what an insect is. And a lot of flies visit flowers, and we generally associate those with bees or wasps. But a syrphid fly is going to have very large eyes that nearly touch in the center. They'll have teeny tiny antennae that kind of barely poke out in between their big bulbous eyes. And then they'll have this kind of folded abdomen at the back. It's kind of like a pancake shape. And that's not a technical term, but it just kind of flops. And adults will nectar feed. So they'll visit flowers, gather nectar, and then they will often lay their eggs on plants or on garden plants. And then their larvae, when those eggs hatch, are going to be carnivorous. And so they're responsible for eating a lot of garden pests and can be really great to encourage and to have around. But since they are just laying their eggs and kind of letting their offspring, kind of do what they will, there's no brood care, and so they don't really nest. And so these are really cosmopolitan species in this family Syrphidae. And they're really of least concern conservation-wise, but they can be incredibly beneficial to attract and to provide resources for. And for the plants that they'll specifically visit, they generally have a preference for white and yellow flowers, especially if they're kind of stinky or pungent. All right. And with that, I'll hand it back to Andrew.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So now we'll talk a little bit about our summer bloomers. So these are our plants that are gonna be blooming kind of in the midsummer time, so kind of June, July. With all of these plants, you know, these bloom times are pretty flexible. So you're not gonna have a plant that's just gonna pop up right on June 1st and then die back right on July 31st by any means. But these are just kind of general ranges for many of these plants that you'll see. So the first one we'll talk about is the California poppy. So despite the name, California poppies are also native to Oregon. They really prefer dry areas that have a lot of sun. Again, these are another kind of ground cover, so they're going to be very low to the ground. If you've spent any time in nature, I'm sure you've seen many of these California poppies around. They're pretty abundant throughout our region. They are an annual, so they do die back after their first year, but they're a great plant to kind of get your garden started. So really they help pad a lot of summer growth. So many perennial plants, ones that are longer lasting, they oftentimes won't flower in the first season or won't have as abundant flowers. But California poppies and many of these other annual plants help kind of support that bloom. And so they kind of bring this real big flash of color into your garden. That can, you know, be easy on the eye, but also help many of these insects and pollinators that we're speaking of. The one thing with California poppies, they don't do great in clay soils, which we have a lot of clay soils here in the Pacific Northwest, especially Washington County area. So you really want to make sure to work some amendments in there, whether that's compost, manure, you name it, before you plant them, just to give them a little bit of a better chance to survive. The next one that we'll highlight is Oregon Sunshine. And this is actually one of my favorite perennial plants, just because it's just cheerful. I mean, just look at it. It just kind of brings a smile to your face, especially when we have a dreary day like we have today. It is a perennial, so it will grow day in and day out. And it is a little bit of a larger ground cover. So they can grow up to about 2 feet tall, give or take. Like the California poppy, it prefers full sun areas and very dry areas. But it's an easy plant to grow. These plants you can often just kind of get started, and they'll have a mind of their own. They'll really kind of take off and really become very full and lush within any of these spaces that we put them in. The next plant that we'll highlight is catmint. So catmint is it's a perennial, so it grows year in and year out. Prefers drier areas, and it likes to have a little bit more sun than the first two that we spoke about. It's going to be about the same size as Oregon Sunshine, so about 2 feet, give or take. And it's a very low maintenance plant. So if it's one of those plants that you can just kind of get started, but then you don't have to do a whole lot with, which is very nice to do in areas of garden spaces that you might be working with. There might be an area that's a little bit further from your house that's harder to get a hose out to, or an area that you don't just spend a lot of time. Catmint's a perfect plant to put there because it really thrives with neglect. It's one of those plants that it doesn't want you dotting over it. Just kind of put it in the ground, let it do what it's going to do, and it'll really take off. It will also bring some cats into your yard as well. So just be mindful of that. Another plant to highlight is going to be camas. Specifically, this one is common camas. It is a perennial, so it'll come year in, year out, and it has these really vibrant blue flowers, as you can see there. And when it blooms in kind of these long tufts, if you see, or spikelets, that you can see these flowers go all the way up. So it's nice to have these blue kind of spikes of flowers in your garden. It's kind of a fun way to be able to incorporate those things. It really needs drier soil. Have a wrong icon on here. It prefers drier soils, but it also can do okay in some moister soils. It's a good plant to work into a rain garden if you are planting one. It as I mentioned, it needs some of the drier sides, so you just put it on the higher sides of any rain garden, and it can really take off. And it's just a nice kind of taller plant to be able to work in. The base of the plant will only be about 2 feet, but those spikelets can get up to 3-4 feet or so. And our next one is Douglas Spirea. Douglas Spirea is another real fun plant to incorporate. As you can see, those flowers really almost look like cotton candy to me. So it's a fun one to work in because it is just a plant that you don't normally see flower types like this. It makes you kind of want to go and pick one up and just kind of walk around with it as you're going along. It is deciduous, so it will die back come fall time. And it will leave kind of this, very kind of stringy leaves and stems, but you can just leave those. It will sprout back out as it goes. It does get a little bit taller. It can get up to about 6 foot tall. So you really want to just be conscious of where you're incorporating it into any space. Douglas Spirea also prefers wetter soils. So, on the moist to the wet side, it is another plant that you can incorporate into a rain garden along with camas. But if you are putting Douglas Spirea in, make sure that it's kind of more towards the base of that rain garden that you're putting in, because it'll really soak up many of those wet soils that you'll see. And I mean, just look at those flowers. They're pretty fun to incorporate just for people to look at and also for plants and animals to check out. Whoops.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's okay. No worries.
There we
Perfect. No worries. And our last summer bloom that we'll highlight tonight is going to be mock orange. Mock orange is on the larger side, so it's going to be 6 to 10 feet tall, give or take. But it grows just about anywhere. It grows in a variety of light types, a variety of soil types. The neat thing about mock orange is it doesn't produce oranges, but it smells like oranges. It has this big fragrance to it that it will really make the entire area smell like oranges, which is a great smell to walk out to. If you have a sitting space within anywhere, if you have a mock orange nearby, you're gonna get that fragrance, and it's really going to expand out through throughout your entire area. So it's a nice one to work in, just for the smell alone. There's nothing like a smell of mock orange during the summertime.
Awesome. All right. So now I'm sure you've sensed a pattern, but we'll be talking about summer pollinators and those ones that will be visiting blooms like that. So we'll start with some of my favorite summer bees. This is going to really be the part of the season where they're really coming out in droves. And so we'll see a huge diversity of bees that are emerging, just as there's a larger diversity of flowering plants during this part of the season. So we'll start with green metallic sweat bees. And they do get their name because they drink sweat. They'll gather salts and sodium from sweat or from tears, or from a mud puddle. But for identification, these green metallic sweat bees, the ones that are in the Agapostemon genus, they are going to have bright green and shiny heads and thoraxes, and then usually most species will have that kind of white and black striped abdomen, and then orange or yellow legs. So they're short-tongued bees, and that means that they're really going to be visiting flowers that have shorter or shallower nectaries, so that they are able to access them. So they really kind of have to force their heads deeper into plants or into flowers in order to gather nectar a lot of the time, which can make them really good pollinators as well, because they really have to spend some time reaching in and grabbing for that nectar with their short tongues. As far as nesting goes, they are solitary and they'll nest in slopes, but usually it'll be like a really sandy soil or on banks. So areas that have some kind of incline, and they're solitary, but they have this really unique behavior where they'll nest in an aggregation. And so there can be many, many solitary tunnel nests where they'll dig down and then they'll have a nest that kind of branches out with little brood chambers that are sectioned off. But there will be kind of one main entrance and then aggregations of those little nests. So they'll all kind of come in and share this little network of like this city of solitary bee nests that are dug into the ground. And that generally provides a little bit more defense from predators or something that might try to get in to the nest, like a cuckoo bee or another parasitoid. As far as conservation is concerned, we don't have a ton of information about green metallic sweat bees right now. And so we need a lot more information. First step for that is really knowing who we have here and who we have living here. And so again, I'm going to kind of plug that Oregon Bee Atlas. And I mean, these are things that you'll kind of start picking up or noticing if you have a lot of green metallic sweat bees visiting certain types of plants. It can be really difficult to identify them to a species level. There are many different species and they have very, very minute differences in morphology. But if you kind of see that main characteristic or know that you have them coming there, it can be good to provide more of those plants in the years to come and things like that. All right, and then there are other sweat bees. They have their name for the same same reason, but they really there are three main genera of sweat bee, and so we'll have that Agapostemon for the green metallics, then we'll have Halictus, and so these are generally really dark bees that have pale hair bands, and so they'll have kind of a thick blonde like hairy stripe on all of the between all of the segments on their abdomen. They'll generally have really kind of bulbous heads or wide heads toward the back. And then their pollen collecting hairs are going to be on their legs. And so kind of that upper part is going to be a little bit hairier or furrier with their scopae. And they'll be grabbing onto pollen as they visit flowers. And so they are generalist foragers on summer blooms. And they are important industrially or in the agricultural industry for watermelon pollination. So as far as nesting goes, they're another ground nester, but these ones will actually nest on flat sandy ground. And so they're not looking for slopes necessarily. They tend to really like patches in lawn. And so if you have a spot where the grass isn't growing very well, they might move into that, or like soccer fields. They'll find really anywhere that has a lot of bare space that's the right texture and gets a lot of sunlight. So they'll kind of seal their tunnels from water by secreting kind of this waxy substance that they'll line the brood chambers within their nest from a special gland called the Duffer's gland, which is near their stinger or just above their stinger. And they'll use that to seal all of their nesting tunnels. And for conservation, right now we have two species that are critically threatened or listed as critically threatened. There may be many more, but we just don't know. And that is due to habitat loss and urbanization. And most of that is just going to be a lack of available nesting sites. And so if there's one thing beyond plants that we can really stress incorporating into your site design is to have areas of ground that are exposed, that allow bees to come in and nest. So not mulching or, of course, with reason. So your site design, you're going to have a lot of different things that you're working around with. But if you are able to incorporate areas where ground nesting bees are able to go in, and often that'll be like spaces in between plants or on slopes that maybe have some ground cover that isn't rooted, that'll all be really great spots for them to nest in. And of course, we always benefit from more information about knowing what species we have as far as conservation is concerned. Okay, and then we'll talk about leafcutter bees. And so leafcutter bees are kind of the summer companion to mason bees. And so they'll nest in houses or in artificial habitats very similarly to them. but instead of collecting mud for their nesting material, they're going to be cutting leaves. And so that necessitates these kind of massive mandibles at the front. And so I tried to pick a picture that really showed that off here. This leaf cutter female will cut these little circles out of petals or leaves in order to line her nesting site. And so that can be a dead giveaway of what you're looking at. If you see kind of that massive pincher at the front, and they only use them to gather nesting materials, it looks intimidating, but they are not defensive features. And then they'll have kind of the characteristic long scopae like the mason bees do. They're in the same family, Megacylidae, so they'll have kind of a similar method of gathering pollen. And they can often be identified by having like bright orange or yellow bellies as well, because they're carrying pollen on those long hairs on their abdomens. And so these are mostly generalist species. There are some species of leafcutter bees that will specialize on asters, like we talked about earlier. So those asters have those phytotoxins in their pollens that a certain group of leafcutter bees are especially adapted in order to digest and may actually be deriving some benefit from having those phytotoxins present. Of course, these are all claims that need to be substantiated by more studies. But I would also mention that leafcutter bees are important for alfalfa pollination because they are large in body enough and will not shy away from being smacked by an alfalfa flower anther like a lot of other bees are. And so they're a little bit more robust and can be bullied a little bit more by their flower counterparts. And for conservation, there are a lot of introduced leafcutter bees, mostly because we do rely on them agriculturally to produce alfalfa, which is important for the cattle and beef industry. And so they're an important link in that kind of loop here in North America. But there are some introduced leafcutter bees that will pollinate invasive plants like yellow star thistle, which is a Mediterranean plant that in its native range will usually be chomped by herbivores and kind of mitigated the spread of too much, but here they will just outcompete a lot of other native plants. And so those are important things to keep in mind when you are purchasing leafcutter bees, if you're doing that for your managed houses. So if you're getting cocoons, just making sure that you're getting native species of leafcutter bee. All right. And then summer is the season of the worker bumblebee. So we met queens in the spring, and then summer is really when the workers are going to be coming out in droves to gather nectar and pollen. And so they're not honey producers, but they will bring back nectar and dehydrate it just a little bit into a little bit of a syrup in order to feed young and to fuel the foragers in the morning before the next day, like a little sip of coffee. But they'll be gathering pollen to bring back to the nest to feed their sisters, or the ones that are developing and that have been laid by the queen. And so they're active all season long. And so bumblebees are just incredible generalists. They'll forage on anything. They're capable of that buzz pollination like we talked about earlier. And they are really just, their goal is to produce as many of their sisters as possible during the one season where they're active. So bumblebees are annual colonies, meaning the majority of the individuals are going to die at the end of the season. And the more queens that they're able to raise or feed in that nest, the more their genetics are going to spread next year. So those queens are going to emerge and mate with drones from other colonies. And then those mated queens will burrow and hibernate through the winter, but we'll get to that. So they're annual colonies, and workers are the ones that are going to be predominantly the foragers, are the ones gathering resources in the summer. And again, like we mentioned with queens, many species of bumblebee are in real trouble right now. And one of the first steps for that, of course, is providing an abundance of blooms throughout the whole season, but most importantly in the spring. All right. And then we've got a bumblebee mimic. So this is a bee fly, and it is a fly that is pollen and nectar feeding as an adult. But they'll have really rotund, furry bodies. They look just like bumblebees, but they've got these great big eyes that touch in the center and tiny little antennae and only one pair of wings. So all bees will have two pairs of wings that kind of form an arc, whereas these will just have one pair of wings and then kind of little thumb-like drumsticks of wings called halteres that will stick out from their sides that they use to adjust their angle of flight. And then they'll generally have very thin legs. And I mean, they'll have kind of like the typical fly grooming behavior where they groom the pollen or anything off of their eyes all the time. And so that will kind of be a dead giveaway of what you're looking at. All right. And as far as conservation is concerned, right now there's 4,500 known species of these bee flies because apparently it is an incredibly effective strategy for survival to look like something that stings. Okay. I'm sorry, my computer is trying to get me to install an update, so I got to put the kibosh on that real quick. Okay. All right, I think we're good. Hopefully it's not going to restart on me. That would be a tragedy. Okay. And then summer, this is when we start seeing butterflies. And so we mentioned that Western tiger swallowtail, that's this lovely lady. And so those are going to be out like crazy in the summer. And so adults are the ones who will nectar feed. They have these long proboscises that are curled up or rolled up at the fronts of their mouths that they'll unroll and then feed while they're hovering. Sometimes they'll land and unroll their proboscis, but they can feed while hovering. And they'll generally visit purple and red, really sweet smelling blooms that have deep nectar tubes. So similar to hummingbird plants, they'll have those tubes at the back that are very deep that contain all of the nectar. And then as far as nesting is concerned, they lay their eggs on host plants, but do not provide any brood care. And so there isn't really a nest or somewhere they'll go. You can provide shelter for butterflies, but generally that's just going to be areas with cover or if you can provide natural cover or areas that they can kind of hide in or rest in during rainstorms or things like that, that can be really helpful for them. I will say, as far as butterfly houses are concerned, I've never seen an adult butterfly actually use one or hang out in one of those little slits during a rainstorm. But you can provide them natural cover to hide out in, and that's going to be a lot more helpful. All right. And then as far as conservation is concerned, butterflies are in rough shape. We're kind of in the middle of another mass extinction of invertebrates right now. And a lot of those reasons are because of habitat loss or pesticide use. I mean, I'm not going to go too far into climate change or anything like that right now, but really the best thing we can do for butterfly conservation is to identify certain host plants of native species that we have here and to provide those during the summertime. Okay. All right.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And so finally, we'll talk a little bit about our late bloomers. So these are going to be some of the last plants to bloom in a season. Sorry, my pups are barking. So these are going to be kind of blooming in the months of August, September. These will be kind of the last ones that you see before the dark winter comes, if you will. Great. So the first one we'll highlight is Douglas aster. So Douglas aster has purple blooms, so it's going to attract those leafcutter bees that Rebecca was just speaking to earlier. They are perennial, so they'll grow back year after year. They're kind of more on the shrub side. So they grow, about 1 foot to 4 feet tall. They're another plant that you can really incorporate into rain gardens because they do pretty well with moist soils. One of the things that I like best about Douglas aster is I consider them to be almost a social flower because they spread by roots. So what you can really do is you can divide up those roots and share those with friends. And so they can you can start to incorporate more and more asters throughout all of your friends' environments. The only problem with that, the only downside is that they spread by roots, so they can quickly overtake areas. So it's just a plant that you really just have to kind of stay on top of if you are incorporating it into any space. The next one we'll highlight is Canada goldenrod. This is one of the last flowers to bloom in a season. So this is going to be kind of your, oops, sorry, I think I'm looking at the wrong one. Oops, oh, yeah, sorry, it is one of the last ones to bloom of the season. So it's going to be kind of your garden's last hurrah, if you will. They have these very kind of spongy yellow blooms, as you can see there, and as you can tell, it really attracts a lot of pollinators. It is perennial, so it's going to grow back it's going to grow back year after year, and it's very, very adaptable. It prefers, full sun, but it can grow in also shadier conditions, and it likes growing in dry to moist soils. And the interesting thing, or one of the things about Canada goldenrod, it can also be, the leaves can also be broken up, and you can actually use it as in teas if you like. If you wanted to steep it within hot water, you can drink it as a tea. The next one we'll highlight is yarrow. Yarrow is the utilitarian plant. Everyone has yarrow somewhere because it does it has so many benefits. It grows up to a foot or two, give or take. It can grow anywhere. It's another plant that's very easy to grow. Yarrow is also known for a lot of its medical properties. If you have like a small cut, you can smash up yarrow leaves and put it in that cut, and it will actually stop it from bleeding. It also can be used to make tea, similar to the Canada goldenrod. And it's one of those plants that you just see everywhere because it has so many benefits. And the blooms, as you can see, are these kind of yellow, or not yellow, these white kind of tops, if you will. So it really shoots those up, and they can grow nice and tall, or they can stay closer to the ground. Just to pretend, it just depends on the conditions that it's growing in. And our final plant that we will highlight is fireweed. Fireweed is another perennial, so it's going to grow year in and year out. And similar to camas that we talked about earlier, it has these large spikelets of blooms. Instead of the blue of camas, it's going to be more of this pink purple color that you can tell here. But it'll have these kind of large blooms that'll be kind of waving in the wind, if you will. And so it's a nice kind of screen that you can pop up along the way. It prefers kind of very sunny conditions, but it is another plant that can grow very easily. But because of that, it also can spread. Because of the amount of flowers that it has, it produces an immense amount of seed. So it really can spread quickly. So it's another plant that you can incorporate, but also just kind of make sure to keep on top of so it doesn't take over any spaces. During the fall months, it really turns vibrant. So it's a nice plant to incorporate for its fall colors.
All right. So kind of our last little hurrah for late season pollinators. I will point out here, this is goldenrod again. It is such an amazing thing to observe. I highly just recommend sitting by your goldenrod plants and just seeing what visitors will show up, because they host just everyone. And it's kind of like this peaceful and serene thing to watch, because they'll all be there at the same time at the height of the sunny day. And yeah, it's a blast to observe. Okay. All right, so we're going to start with my favorite summer pollinators, late season pollinators. And these are going to be longhorned bees. So these are bees that are in the genus Melisodes. There are many, many different species, but they're all kind of active during this last leg of the warm season. And so they're very rotund. They have kind of these round bodies. They're generally pretty yellow and hairy. And then females have these really, really long hairs on their back legs. They're like just incredible pollen pants like leg warmers that will collect pollen. And then males have very, very long antennae. And so both males and females will have these really kind of striking features that are unique to longhorn bees alone. And they're really, really fun to watch. So as far as foraging goes, since they're active so late in the season, they will somewhat specialize on plants. And so we see them a lot on sunflowers, asters, and daisies. And really nothing else. So they have a preference for those types of plants. And then they are solitary. So they'll nest just a single female in the ground. And so they'll hit that flat ground. And then those females will line their brood cells with that kind of same waxy secretion from that Duffer's gland. And often they'll be found nesting in aggregations. And so if you've found a site that's good for a longhorn bee to nest in, you'll usually see lots of them nesting all together in one area. And then again, as far as conservation is concerned, we really do need more information about them. Since they're active for such a short window of the season, it also is pretty difficult to collect them in a timely manner and then have all of that species information in order to track, their populations over time. But as far as that, all I can really say is that we know that they have specific foraging needs or have specific flowers that they like. And if we can provide those for them, we can really encourage their population numbers, which is always a good thing. All right, and so then we're kind of going full circle on bumblebees now. And so this is the time of season where we'll see males, and males are very endearing. They tend to look real shaggy and kind of dainty in body. They're just not quite as luxurious or beautiful as the females, but they'll start coming out. And at the end of the season, the bumblebee colonies, before they kind of dwindle out, will raise just a whole bunch of reproductive individuals, as many as they can. So the whole point is that hopefully they raised a ton of worker bees or enough of a worker bee population before hitting this later part of the season, so that those workers can go out, gather tons and tons of pollen, and feed lots of queens and drones. And so those reproductive individuals will start coming out usually in like August, and they will of course forage for their own energy, and bumblebee queens will usually need to forage and eat a lot of pollen before they're able to mate. But then once they mate, the males will die, and then the queens will find a burrow to hibernate in underground. So providing them with food sources during this time is really essential, but then also providing them ground cover through the fall and through the winter is really, really important for supporting bumblebee populations. So having those deciduous shrubs that shed their leaves and then provide ground cover is really great for bumblebee habitat. And yeah, there's a whole Xerces Society campaign called Leave the Leaves that is for bumblebee conservation, and a lot of moths and other insects will hibernate in ground cover like that through the winter. And so not being quite so tidy with your gardening at the end of the season can actually be a really great conservation practice. All right, because of course we know that there are tons of bumblebee species that are in decline. And so just providing them with every little bit of habitat or shelter that they need at critical stages of the season is going to be really important. All right, so I've talked about a few different fly species. So flies are really active pretty much all season. I only wanted to highlight one per, but this is another great fly pollinator, and these are Taconid flies. And they tend to have really kind of fat abdomens with wiry hairs, and then of course that large eye, small antennae combo. But they will nectar and pollen feed, and generally they'll find white and yellow flowers. And yarrow is an amazing fly pollinator plant because it has that kind of nice wide landing pad for them. So they'll come and land on it, they'll catch some rays, and then gather nectar and pollen from those plants. They're also really attracted to kind of stinky flowers. So I know like we have sea holly at the farm where Bee and Bloom is, and it is like farmhouse stink, and it is covered in, well, really everything visits it that part of the season because they bloom so late, but it also attracts a lot of flies. I'm not totally sure if that plant is native, but it does provide a food resource at the least. It's not invasive. All right. And of course, so they don't provide brood care. They'll lay their eggs on larvae of other insects generally. So they'll be parasitoids of like beetles, wasps, or solitary bees. And so they'll find the larvae or the developing insect, lay their eggs, and their eggs will hatch and consume their prey or their host insect. And so really it's just a one-stop food provision, and then there's no brood care and no nesting. And their conservation is really of little concern, but they do provide a nice biocontrol service and pest control. And so providing habitat for them or providing blooms that attracts them and can be really beneficial for your gardens. And then the last pollinators I will talk about are Vespid wasps. And so these ones are really, you're going to be seeing them in droves in the fall time. And so these are European wasps, so they're introduced. And there are the yellow jackets or paper wasps, and you can kind of tell the difference between the color of their antennae. Otherwise, they look very similar. And they have yellow and black patterning. But the adults will nectar feed, but then they'll hunt for other prey to feed their young. And at certain points of the season, they can be really important cleanup crews. So they'll find, decaying matter. They'll be like somewhat detritivores, or they'll pick up, like they eat tons of cabbage whites. And so if you are trying to prevent cabbage whites from hosting on your kale or brassicas, they can be really great for biocontrol of those. And so I don't necessarily recommend getting rid of them. I know a lot of people confuse European paper wasps. So the ones with the orange antennae kind of tend to be the lesser of the evils, and they'll provide that same biocontrol crew. But yellow jackets really give a bad name to themselves this time of year because there are so many of them and so few resources available that they'll start picking on you at your barbecues. So you can put up traps for them, but if you are going to be doing any yellow jacket control, say if you have honeybee hives, it can be important to do some yellow jacket control. I would put your pheromone traps up to collect yellow jacket queens in early spring and late fall. So before they hibernate or before they nest, can be really important. All right, and with that, we're going to wrap it up. Oh, Andrew, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you for catching that. So we're just going to touch base on a couple of additional resources that are available to folks, and then we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A. Great. So if you just want to switch over to the next. So there's a couple of really great native plant guides that are specifically designed for our area here in kind of the Portland metro area, as well as in Washington County. Those are the native plants for the Willamette Valley Yards pamphlet, as well as the Meadowscaping Handbook. Both these do a great job of highlighting many of the plants that you saw tonight, as well as many, many others. There's such a wide variety that we just couldn't cover everything tonight. So, and in that follow-up email that I will send you all tomorrow, you will have links to both of these resources so you can take a look at them electronically. The other program I want to highlight is the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. So that program is available to just about every city in the Portland metro area. If you haven't heard of it before, it's very worthwhile looking into. The idea behind the program is really to help support urban gardeners make their yards, both backyard and front yard, into habitats. And so through that process, you can meet with a specialist on your site, actually do a site walkthrough with them. They can kind of talk about what your goals are, help you kind of get some ideas on how you want to design your area or your space, and then provide you some discount codes or discount coupons to many native plant nurseries and nurseries around our area, so you can go out and start doing that work. Once you're ready, you can apply to have your habitat, your space certified on these certification criteria, and then you can certify at 3 different levels. And more information about that program can be seen on their website, backyardhabitats.org, and I'll also include a link to that website in that follow-up email that I just mentioned. And here's our contact information, both for the district as well as for Rebecca. I'll also be CCing Rebecca on the email that I'll send to you. Also, you will have her direct contact information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Even if they come, a few days down the line, we're always more than happy to answer them.
Absolutely.
So with that, let's head over to our Q&A. So I've got a few questions already in the queue, but if anyone has any additional ones, please feel free to go ahead and continue to add them on, and we'll just start at the top and work our way through. So it looks like the first one is for you, Rebecca.
Okay.
So can you describe how the butterfly life cycle goes throughout the year? They're a little curious about the time frame about after the caterpillar eats leaves and spins a cocoon. What happens when the plants have lost their leaves?
Great question. So the different species are going to have different active periods that they're working through their life cycle. And so typically a butterfly caterpillar will go through, I'm really digging back into my entomology classes here, but I think it's 5 instars. And so they'll go through 5 separate molts while they're eating all of their food before they pupate. And so most butterfly species here in the Pacific Northwest, since we have such kind of a short active window, are going to pupate and then hibernate. And then they'll be the ones that come out again next season. And so a great thing is that a lot of times those host plants, if they're deciduous or drop their leaves, that provides the chrysalis or the caterpillar cocoon some ground cover to hibernate in through the winter. And gosh, I'm going to have to check some of my old references again, really to get that butterfly life cycle down. But I do know that it ranges quite a bit between different species, and that the shedding of the host plant leaves is something that can be really beneficial to particular butterfly species for hibernating through the winter.
Great. So the next question we have is, which bee species need our help the most right now? And how can I make areas for them to nest in my garden?
Great question. So I would say, of course, bumblebees are getting a lot of attention, but that's because we have a lot more information about the species we've been that have lived here and have traditionally lived here. So we've been tracking bumblebees for quite a while, and they tend to be kind of the more charismatic of our native bee species, and so they get a lot of attention. So we have more bumblebee species that are listed as critical for habitat conservation. And so that's going to be a lot of the techniques like providing really, really early spring blooms for queens that are just emerging before they nest. And then it's going to be providing a whole range of flowers throughout the season for worker bees to gather as much food as they can. And then providing ground cover during the fall and through the winter for hibernating queens. Anything we do to support bumblebees is also going to support a larger range of bee species. But beyond that, I think the most effective practices right now are going to be with identifying what species are here. And so supporting citizen science initiatives or supporting organizations that are doing a lot more survey work, whether you're actually joining them or doing financial contributions or working with them in any capacity, is going to really help us figure out what we can do, really target what we can do to help them. Beyond that, it's really just about providing blooms that are, throughout the entire warm season, ground cover in the fall, and then reducing pesticide use as much as possible and limiting introduced species that are vectoring pathogens like honeybees.
Great. Next question. What bees like wood for nesting? They have some wood on the ground and they're hoping bees will use it.
Yeah, so there is a group of small carpenter bees that live in the Pacific Northwest, and they're in the family Serratina, and they will nest in little holes in wood. I don't know if they have quite powerful enough jaws to chew their own holes. There are large carpenter bees further south and in the Southwest that are very impressive large black bees that have massive jaws that chew holes in untreated wood to nest in, but we do have some small carpenter bees here. And then if there are secondary holes, so anything that's left behind by beetles, or if you've drilled holes in downed logs, all of those are going to be accessible to secondary tunnel nesters. So like mason bees, various osmia, leaf cutting bees, and then yeah, your small carpenters.
Great. Let's see. Another question. I see lots of really tiny dark bees too. Do they nest in the ground?
So it could be a couple of different groups of bees that are small and dark. So most, I would say 90% of the solitary bees that we have here will be nesting in the ground. They have, and between species and between groups, they're going to have different preferences for ground nest sites. Some of them like slopes, some of them like flat ground. Most of them have a preference for sandy soil. And so of course here that is going to be a limiting factor because we have a lot of clay soil. So if you're doing soil amendments for your plants, those can also be beneficial for ground nesting bees. But yeah, I think probably if you're seeing it, and it also depends on what time of season. So if you're seeing them early in the spring, those are most likely going to be mining bees or andrena bees. And those do nest in the ground, and they'll nest on slopes, usually in sandy soil in large aggregations.
Let's see. Another question. If an insect shows up in an area, can we expect to have them return there again? And do some plants need to be rotated to fresh dirt area annually? If you want to take the first one, I can take the second.
Awesome. So if you're providing a good habitat for that particular insect in one season, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that you're going to see it again in years to come. And it won't be the same individuals, but it may be the offspring that they've left behind, and you may be attracting different insects of that same species or that same type to your yard in years to come. But yeah, supporting populations and then here now in the short term, and then maintaining the habitat that you've provided for them that's worked in the past, you can pretty reasonably assume that it's going to be providing habitat for the same species for years to come or in the long term.
Great. And in regards to kind of the need for rotating plants, so many of the perennials you can just leave in place year in and year out. Oftentimes plants have a lot of beneficial factors that you can slowly incorporate into different areas, especially annual plants. So many annual plants and perennials as well can be nitrogen fixers. So you really want to start looking at these at kind of the plants that you're putting in place as plant communities, and kind of build in some that have a lot of these different factors. So you can put plants, I believe it's, I want to say it's largely lupin is one of my favorite nitrogen fixtures that you can incorporate into like a planting guild. And then if you incorporate other plants that are more deciduous, that drop their leaves, that helps kind of boost up the soils. So looking at these kind of plant guilds is a really great way to kind of have a nice plant community that all kind of support each other with many of their different needs. All right, another question looks like, is there a way that gardeners can contribute to knowing more about the pollinators and their relationships to our native plants? I would say just attending as many workshops like these as you can. That's going to be your real best bet, that you can learn a little bit more about the needs of pollinators so that you can then incorporate many of those practices and those plants into your gardens. And oftentimes you'll start to find plants that really stand out the more and more that you learn about them. And then you can learn which pollinators that they best support, and you can start kind of supporting them in that manner.
If I may just shout out a couple
Yeah,
of
please.
citizen science collaboratives. If you're specifically looking at tracking bee populations or bee species that you are hosting, there are, so I mentioned the Oregon Bee Atlas, and so that's through OSU Extension. And then there is Bumble Bee Watch, which is Xerces Society. And then if you're really getting into tracking bee species, you can always snap pictures of them and upload your sightings to a forum called Bug Guide. And sometimes the entomologist there will help you with identifications. And then there's a good digital record of what you've seen and where. So those are also helpful things to do.
Great. And I'll definitely make sure to include links to the Oregon Bee Atlas as well as to Bumblebee Watch in that follow-up email. So you can have a quick, easy link to check out those different community science efforts.
Awesome.
All right. Next question. They heard that Osoberry is a great early bloomer, and the reason for that is that the flowers smell like cat pee. Is that because it attracts flies, which are active earlier in the season? They just want to kind of check before they start, talking to their work crews about that, if that was true or if there was a different reason for those smelling flowers.
Great
I
question.
don't know that much about Osoberry myself. I don't know. Do you have much experience with that plant, Rebecca?
I don't, but I do know that particular chemical cue can be attractive to flies. And so that could be a reason. I'm just not I'm not sure about this particular situation. I may be wrong, but I'm digging back into my botany classes to the recesses. I think that also might be a defense against deer
That would make
eating it.
sense. Yeah, because Osoberry is deer resistant. I do know that. So
Cool.
I think that probably is kind of a side benefit of it being resistant to deer.
Awesome.
Okay, next question that we have. So they've found that they have a lot of queen bumblebees burrowing in their yard. They're working on pulling out overgrown invasive species. What would be the best time of year or things to look for so to not disturb these queen bumblebees?
Great question. So here we're balancing priorities and invasive species management for plants is it has to take priority a lot of the time, and generally doing removal for those is going to be when it's wet. It's the easiest to uproot a lot of those invasive plants, and you may be disturbing some hibernating bumblebee species in their nests, but you kind of just cross your fingers and hope not. And yeah, just getting it taken care of and then, doing your best to provide that undisturbed ground cover in years to come. It's really hard to be perfect on all fronts.
It is. And
Yeah.
it's one of those things that, maybe it has to take a step back this year, but hopefully next year that the habitat will be so greatly improved that they will return or new colonies will come back. So,
Right.
okay. Another question about mason bee habitat. So they purchased a mason bee habitat that is bamboo. 98% of the bamboo is full of mason bees. They just set out the bee house in the same location as is. Do they need to cut open the bamboo and harvest the mason bee cocoons or just leave it the way that it is? They plan to purchase another bee house before they start nesting again. Is there a mason bee house that you would suggest?
Great question. So at this point in the season, they should be poking their heads out, chewing their way out of their cocoons and nests really any day now if they haven't started already. So I would just put the house up and let whatever is in there emerge. But if they are that full, you will need to provide more more nesting spots for them. Or they'll disperse, which also isn't the end of the world. So they'll disperse and find nesting habitat in a place that has a more abundance of nesting holes. But you can definitely add another house or another feature with more nesting holes, and you can maintain a lot more of them that way. As far as mason bee houses that I would recommend, there are tons out there that are good. The only thing I would mention is that they should be about 6 inches in depth. You don't want to get the ones that are really short. Like a lot of the ones that you see on like Amazon tend to not be quite deep enough for mason bees to nest in. But anything that you purchase from, say, like Crown Bees in Washington, a friend of mine makes nesting blocks and trays and things like that. I'd be happy to share that information with you. If you're looking for something local, you can just shoot me an email. But otherwise, I mean, you can get a good mason bee house in a lot of different places. And the general criteria for what makes a good mason bee house, we have talked about in previous classes. Maybe we could share those links too.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. And if you really want a nice in-depth dive into mason bees, the on that same YouTube channel that you'll have the recording for this presentation, Rebecca and I recently did a working with mason bee webinar as well, and that recording is available, so you can see that as well. Okay, next question. They have a community garden plot. Should they talk to the garden coordinator about trying to incorporate a pollinator garden into their lot?
Yeah.
I would say absolutely, right?
For sure. Yeah, as much of it as you can. I mean, of course, community gardens, it's all about making compromises and balancing priorities. So a lot of times those are specific for food, but as much as, you know, you're willing, or everyone is willing to put in, it's, yeah, the better.
Yeah, and even if you're able just to, you know, if there are areas of the community garden that you can set aside that don't have specific plots, whether that's on the edges or you name it, just incorporating some of these plants are a great way to do it. But I would say absolutely. Okay, let's see. A follow-up question. If they accidentally uncover burrowing bees, what is the best next step? Cover them back up, leave them uncovered, or something else?
It depends. Well, yeah, I've made lots of whoops accidents like that before, and then usually I'll just stop what I'm doing and try to put it back as best I can, and then like leave and hope I didn't disturb them too much. If you uncover a bumblebee nest like that, yeah, cover them up and get out of there as fast as you can. Solitary bees like mining bees or sweat bees are not going to chase you down or anything. But yeah, I would say just trying to undo what you did, or, you know, try to keep yourself from doing further damage to their nesting site is best. But I mean, of course, we're all going to have like those oops moments when we're figuring out how to deal with our landscapes and making them good habitat. It just happens. So don't beat yourself up.
It's okay, it happens sometimes. Okay, looks like the last question that we have for the night. So in regards to wintering habitat for pollinators, is spring or fall thatching needed for native pollinator hedgerows with many of the plants that we talked about today?
I don't think I'm familiar with that term.
I'm not either.
Okay.
I was trying to look it up myself. Okay. Let me see if anything comes up. If that person wants to kind of write in describing it, I would be very helpful. Most of the things that I'm seeing is kind of dealing with roof and dethatching. So cutting down dead plants. Great, thank you so much. So yeah, so in terms of with many of the plants that we spoke of, whether it's deciduous, you know, kind of cutting off those stems, would you recommend that for winter habitat or just leaving them freestanding?
It depends. So a lot of those dead twigs or dead branches off of plants can provide nesting habitat for bees already. And so you might have like small carpenter bees or small secondary tunnel nesters that are in there and that are developing. And so you could leave them intact and they might have a benefit, but then if you cut them down and left them on the ground underneath and had them provide cover, that would also provide a benefit. So yeah, I guess I would say maybe leave some, cut some.
Yeah, that's probably a nice balance to be able to do. And, you know, as I think you mentioned earlier, you know, nature is messy overall. So oftentimes it's, you know, as long as you're leaving it in the general vicinity, I think that's going to be the best, whether it's, you know, standing upright or on the ground, those just having it there is really what matters. So I like your idea of kind of leaving some up, taking some down, kind of having that balance. I think is always good.
Awesome.
Very cool. Well, that is our last question for the night tonight. But if anyone has any questions later on, as I mentioned, you will have the contact information for both Rebecca and myself, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that you might have afterwards. So please feel free just to shoot us an email, and we can follow up with you that way.
Great.
Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone.
Have a good night.